which is part of the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs in the United Nations Secretariat in New York. We are very excited about this. As I said, we will start in a minute with a group of panelists. We are very happy that they're able to join us. But first, a few logistical issues. We very much encourage you all to use tweets and other social media and use the hashtag UNCEG, so UN Community Engagement Guidelines for Peace. Hashtag UNCEG for the number 4 peace. So we can connect, so you can connect with other participants and follow updates as well in the future. We're very happy to announce that we also have interpretation. At the bottom of your screen, you can see a button for interpretation, and we have French and Spanish interpretation, so you can click on the language that you prefer. That would be great. Make sure you click on your mute original audio so you can really listen to the language that you prefer and don't get muzzled by 2 languages going on at the same time. At the end of, after the panelists, we hope to have a significant amount of time for question and answers and comments and reflections. You can use the chat function for that. We will also be able to take questions through the raising the hand function. So happy to give you the floor if you have any reflections or comments. We would much appreciate if you could mute your microphone, and I think actually they're all muted at the moment. We might control that, so we reduce the number of interferences by noise from your side. So much appreciate your cooperation in that. It's really nice to see faces. So if you could keep your camera on, of course, we understand that there might be internet connection issues or bandwidth. So that would be your own assessment. But it's really nice to see so many faces on the screen. This is a public event. It will be recorded. As you know, it is also live streamed on YouTube. And we will store it and make it available also after this event. So with regard to the context that we are launching this particular set of guidelines, we have seen over the last few decades a really important change in the nature of violent conflict. They have become much more protracted, much more complex, involving many more non-state armed actors, and evolving with multiple drivers that are not always very easy to identify. This has meant that, for example, the traditional tools of the United Nations, including peacekeeping operations and mediation efforts, are less effective. And this has led to the United Nations adapting and also assessing how they can best respond to these changes. This includes, for example, a set of resolutions that have been adopted by the General Assembly and the Security Council in 2016 that became known as the Sustaining Peace resolutions that emphasize in particular the importance of inclusive national ownership and the importance of working with civil society, in particular women and youth groups and youth and women-led organizations. This was also, of course, reflected in the Women, Peace and Security and the Youth, Peace and Security agenda, and the latter was launched in 2015 with Security Council Resolution 2250, and the Youth, Peace and Security agenda has become really an important drive on recognizing the important role that young people in particular can play in peace building. We really have become much more important. We have become really recognizing within the UN system that community engagement is really critical. Using the capacities and the knowledge at the local and a national level and involve them in peace-building processes, in particular because a lot of the conflicts are at the local level, and sometimes the peace processes at the national level are not going that well. As I mentioned, the traditional role of the UN in negotiating peace agreements has become much more difficult with so many more non-state actors. And conflicts at the local level around land or water, exacerbated by climate change, has been really important. And the local communities, the local mechanism to address these conflicts have become much more important. So the Secretary General himself has recognized that community engagement in analysis, in planning and programming, in implementation, and also in monitoring and evaluation is really key. And he has asked for that strongly in various reports. Now, why is that? Why is it that we think in the United Nations that this is so important? Now, first of all, the UN has in various documents recognized the importance of the people-focused response. We need to look at the needs of the people. We need to look at the priorities of communities. We need to engage with them to get those needs and priorities up front. As I said, national ownership is really key. We will never succeed with peace building and peace processes if there are no local actors and stakeholders who are really carrying this forward. Peace building is also much more sustainable if we build on the capacities that exist at the local and the national level, so that these processes go on even after projects ends. Often local actors can also act more quickly, and that is of course very important when the circumstances are ripe and things change rapidly on the ground, and we need to act quickly to respond to that. Responses are much more relevant because of the building on the local capacities and the local experience. And finally, engagement is with local actors and giving them the lead and putting them in the driver's seat is much more cost effective. An example, of course, of all of this has happened during the COVID pandemic, where it has been very clear that the involvement of local communities who have the trust, have the legitimacy and the networks to really respond in a very effective way to the pandemic. So the guidelines were developed directly in a response to a call of the Secretary General for the United Nations on the ground to develop community engagement strategies. And the guidelines developed are really meant to help the UN on the ground to develop these strategies, and jointly, of course, with civil society. And we hope that these guidelines are very much helping with the operational aspects of our work on the ground in engaging with communities. We also want to recognize that these guidelines are linked to other processes within the UN. There's a very strong emphasis on the importance of civic space. We see in many countries that the civic space has been declining, has been under pressure. And so there is a civic space guidance that also refers, of course, to our guidelines that focuses on the participation of civil society within UN processes, the promotion of civil space, and the protection of civil society actors. And some of these 3 Ps are, of course, also reflected in our guidelines. They're also very much related to the Secretary General's call to action for human rights, as of course, the participation in political processes and the right of expression and the right of assembly are fundamental human rights, and we need to protect that space. We also have seen over the last years an enormous increase in the number of social movements that have, of course, also come to the street and protest in peaceful ways. And that is, of course, something that the UN has also very much recognized. During COVID, they have first declined somewhat because of the restrictions on gatherings, but they have very much reappeared in the last couple of months, as you can see daily around the world in the media, and partly reacting to government measures related to the pandemic, but also going back to some of the issues that have emerged in 2019 when protests really reached historic levels, such as inequalities, corruption, issues around elections and election outcomes. So we very much are now at the point where we need to implement these guidelines, and we very much encourage all our participants today to take these guidelines forwards, look for partners on the ground, and implement and pilot these guidelines with your strategic partners, whether they are in the UN or civil society. So before we go to the panel, we have an exciting innovation, and that we will introduce a poll that asks you to reflect on the guidelines and respond to this poll. So I ask my colleagues to run the poll now for a few minutes before we go to our panelists. Marina? So the question is, why are these guidelines important in your work? And you can choose two options. And you can see the results appearing in real time. Very exciting. So we'll ask Marina to present the poll results after the panelists. So let me introduce our speakers today. First, Megan Schmidt of the Quaker United Nations representative office in New York. She leads the Peacebuilding Program, and her work centers on supporting colleagues within the UN environment to develop and implement more holistic and people-centered strategies for peace. Previously, she also worked on the responsibility to protect. Our second speaker is Fabio Olivad. He's a peace and development advisor in the Resident Coordinator's Office of the United Nations in Tunisia. But previously, he had worked in a similar role in Cambodia and was very much involved in the development of the guidelines through national consultations. Fabio has worked for 12 years or so within the United Nations, and before he was a peace and development advisor, he worked at the UN Staff College in Turin. And he has a long background also in academia in peace building. Tajikan Shabdanova is the director of the Foundation for Tolerance International in Kyrgyzstan, and she has been involved in peace building from the beginning of a very massive violent conflict in Kyrgyzstan in 2010 that some of you might remember. The organization that she works for and heads, the Foundation for Tolerance International, is one of the biggest organizations on peace building in Central Asia. And she works very closely with the UN system on peace building in Kyrgyzstan. So I first will give the floor to Megan Schmidt, our colleague from the Quaker's office in New York.
Thanks so much, Henk-Jan. Can you hear me? Everything is good? Great. So good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. As was said, my name is Megan, and I'm one of the Quaker UN reps for the Quaker United Nations office in New York. And I've had the privilege to work with the joint working group on the community engagement guidelines for these past 2 years. So I'm really excited for this day to come, to be able to have this launch and to speak with all of you and hear from all of you on your reflections, your questions, and your ideas on how to take this forward. So to start, I wanted to begin by reflecting on why we at the Quaker UN office saw the creation of these guidelines as necessary and valuable for the UN system and its work to build and sustain peace. And it really starts for us with that central point and the importance of inclusion. We see civil society as key to the very social fabric that's needed for building and sustaining peace. And so often in conflict situations, especially situations of transition or extreme fragility, these actors, the peace-building actors, community leaders, community actors, they themselves might be the primary peace-building agents. They're the ones with localized expertise from the long-term engagement that they're doing at the community level or the national levels. And it's an expertise that so often we find is missing from policy discussions. So when it's this kind of building or strengthening of partnerships and engagement between the UN and communities in a meaningful and a transparent way that's grounded in equality and safety, that when we see that moving forward, we'll be able to collectively enhance our shared efforts to build and sustain peace. And so Henk-Jan had referenced the Sustaining Peace resolutions, the Secretary General's recommendation. When we saw that recommendation a few years ago that was calling for the creation of that system-wide guidance, we really saw this as a valuable opportunity for the UN as a whole to develop, and then now that the guidelines are out, to be able to implement a tool that can support partnership and engagement for peace building and sustaining peace. And then we welcomed the opportunity to be able to work with UN colleagues at the headquarters level in this joint working group to develop the process for drafting and now for rolling out the guidelines. So I'd like to reflect a little bit on how the community engagement guidelines were developed and the working methods that we as the joint working group employed. Because in many ways, through our approach, we were really trying to work toward and kind of embody the goals that we were seeking, which is to foster inclusion and partnership. And so if you'll bear with me, I'm just gonna have a very brief PowerPoint with a couple of visuals to support my intervention, talking about the process that we led. Okay. So at the heart of this process has been the recognition that the voices and the experiences of UN colleagues from the field and civil society need to be heard if the UN's going to develop guidance that supports how it engages with communities. And so first, this really included the creation of the joint working group itself, and it had participation from throughout the UN system. So the Office for the Commissioner, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, UNWomen, DPPA, the Department of Peace Operations, UNDP, and then the Peacebuilding Support Office within DPPA facilitating and guiding the way on this process. And on the civil society side, we've been really pleased to be part of this group alongside our partners, the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict and the International Peace Institute. And this working group has then worked together since December of 2018 to conceptualize and then develop these guidelines. So then second is how the working group actually sought to learn and to hear from UN and civil society actors globally on their understanding of peace building, sustaining peace, their experience within the context that they're working in, and to hear about if and how they've worked together on different peace building initiatives. And so through a global survey that was published in all of the UN languages, and then a global online consultation that we were able to carry out in partnership with Peace Direct, the joint working group was able to include the experiences, the perspectives and the insights of hundreds of colleagues to be able to, learn from their work. And with the use of video technology, we're also able to have over 40 different conference discussions with colleagues to dive even deeper into their learning from their country-based experience. So on this slide, you'll see a couple of visuals that connect to the survey process. So a map on the left that's showing the diversity of countries of origin of respondents. We had over 70 countries represented. And then on the right, a word map that was created that really brings forward a lot of the phrases or points that were emphasized throughout the survey responses themselves. And then here, when thinking about the video teleconferences that I referenced, we were able to talk with colleagues in Cambodia, Liberia, Mali, Guatemala, and Somalia. And the 3-day consultation gave us the opportunity to learn from and hear from over 400 participants and their reflections on sustaining peace, their immediate thoughts on the draft recommendations we had at the time, and to be able to learn and hear from UN and civil society colleagues on how to further strengthen local ownership and partnership. So this inclusive approach really allowed us in the working group to truly learn from these experiences, the best practices that were shared, the challenges that were identified. And I have to say that throughout that entire process, I was really struck by the honesty of participants, the openness, the willingness to really freely share their experience, their knowledge, the challenges that they're going through. And I continue to be appreciative of all of the time that so many invested at that point, that you're investing in today in this conversation and going forward in the implementation. And so now I just want to spend the remainder of my time really talking about the guidelines themselves, which includes 7 key recommendations and a dozen different country examples. And these recommendations, the examples, they're there to support and be a tool to support UN practice at the field level. So the recommendations, the examples that were identified, this was all developed and informed partly through that inclusive consultative process I was just talking about. And then a real, whole of UN approach was taken at strategic times in the drafting. So being able to hear from offices, from programs outside of the working group, who were then able to share their expertise, their reflections on the drafts. And it really allowed us to have a strengthened final product and to also sensitize this process within the UN system. And so through the different country examples, what we sought to do is to illustrate the breadth of ways that UN colleagues are already working with civil society and communities, and to share the learning from those experiences. And so we had a dozen different examples that you'll see throughout the document. I'm drawing from experiences shared from Guatemala, Somalia, Cambodia, Sri Lanka, Liberia, Morocco, Niger, Sierra Leone, Kyrgyzstan, India, and Mali. And then the recommendations, they provide support both in working methods, so the principles that should inform community engagement, as well as the practical measures to develop or enhance partnership. Again, they should be seen as this additional tool that can support developing new approaches or building upon existing efforts for community engagement, specifically through that peacebuilding and sustaining peace lens. And so I just want to go through these recommendations that you'll see in front of you and that are, go into great detail within the guidelines document itself. And so what do they include? First is a deeper understanding of local context through respectful, coherent, and flexible engagement, operational and strategic coherence, and effective coordination in community engagement across the UN in the field, safety and protection in restricted environments through conflict-sensitive and risk-informed approaches, inclusive and meaningful participation of local civil society actors, community-based capacity building, including financing for peacebuilding, meaningful participation of local women and women civil society actors in peacebuilding and sustaining peace, and meaningful youth engagement in peacebuilding and sustaining peace at the local level. And so I just want to spend a couple of moments also sharing my reflections on what I feel is meaningful about these recommendations. And so first, it really relates to the principles that you'll see throughout this document. I believe that these principles, they can be found in the language that we use. And so it's words including respect, people-centered, locally led, meaningful, encouragement, full understanding. The very first recommendation itself, it's grounded in the recognition that respect must be at the heart of all interactions. And UN colleagues, they're so often carrying out their work with these principles in mind, but through including them in the very foundation of the guidance, it's my hope that the guidelines will then also further support UN efforts to work in a principled and peaceful manner, so seeking to embody the change that we're all hoping to see in the world. Second, I want to bring attention to the emphasis on UN coherence. So whether it's regarding analysis, financing, outreach, or partnership development, you'll find that through the recommendations and the variety of examples that are within the document, that they illustrate the importance of centralized and streamlined approaches. And additionally, attention is given to the importance of flexibility, ensuring adequate capacity, and coordinating throughout the UN country settings to support a whole of UN approach for community engagement. Lastly, I want to take time to focus on those practical approaches and the examples identified in the guidance that relate to implementation. And so through the 7 recommendations, you'll find information around a range of practical measures that can be taken when seeking to build or to strengthen community engagement. So this includes, but of course is not limited to, an emphasis on developing and carrying out contextual and conflict sensitive guidance for engagement, conducting various mappings of civil society and their contributions and work as it relates to peace building and sustaining peace, the need for gender sensitive measures and funding models to sustain the work of women-led peace building efforts, the importance of an increase in operational and financial sustainability for youth-led peace building, and the need for predictable, flexible, and risk-tolerant funding for peace building. And within there's a few different examples or ideas of potential models that can be taken forward and tested as it relates to exploring more flexible financial options. And it's my hope that the guidelines will provide UN staff with new ideas or new approaches or additional tools that when they're contextualized for the environment that you're working in, it'll be able to support you in developing or enhancing efforts for community engagement. The guidelines, they're a tool to contribute to the UN's global work. And I hope that colleagues working at the field level will find value in this document as you seek to take its words into practice in your daily efforts to build and sustain peace. And so with that, just again to appreciate everybody's time and contributions throughout this process leading into today, and to hand it back to you, Henk-Jan.
Thanks so much, Megan. That was really a comprehensive overview and really good. You touched both on the process and the outcome, but also highlighting that the process in itself is so important, and that is of course often the case with peace building, where the process is as important or even more important sometimes than the outcome, and the process is fundamental in reaching outcomes. So next, I'm happy to hand over to Fabio. Fabio is the only UN colleague on the panel, and was very much involved in, as I said, the development of the guidelines when in his previous job he was based in Cambodia. They're now based in Tunisia, and maybe he can say also a few things how important the guidelines are in Tunisia. So Fabio, the floor is yours. I'm very happy to see you, and you have about 10 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you, Henk-Jan, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Yes, indeed, we were involved when in Cambodia in the development of the guidance, and in itself, it was a great opportunity. I've been in Cambodia for 3 years, and since July, I am working in Tunisia. So I spent maybe the 70% of the presentation on Cambodia, and maybe share some highlights and some perspectives also now the guidance and the guidelines can actually be and are be used in the context of Tunisia. So starting with Cambodia, and Cambodia and Tunisia are very different contexts where the UN is operating. Talking about Cambodia, Cambodia is a country with a remarkable and lasting UN legacy. So I'd like to start with that because thinking with the legacy left by the peacekeeping mission in the 90s, where over 18 months, over $2 billion, were spent in a peacekeeping multidimensional mission. And you can imagine what is the legacy that is left among the local population, the community, the civil society, and the government. And so I'm starting with that because over the time we see Cambodia as the country that doesn't need any longer peace building. And there was, I think, the perception in the last few years. And there was also a sort of dissatisfaction by the civil society looking at the UN no longer doing the typical peace building or even peacekeeping kind of interventions. And over the years, also Cambodia has been kind of witnessing also a shrink in the democratic space. And in that context, I think the offer to help develop the guidelines was quite useful in, first of all, trying to rewire the relationship between the UN and the civil society, including also community-based organizations. And the opportunity was given by itself for the consultations that we were invited to conduct in Cambodia, I think over a period of a couple of months in the spring of 2019. And there was an opportunity actually to spark an idea that was launched in some of these consultations of having a regular annual peace building, or as we call it, annual dialogue between civil society and UN on sustaining peace. And that was the first ever, because the peace building jargon was, as I said, kind of forgotten and lost in the context of Cambodia. And that consultation itself actually led to this recognition: what is the mandate of the UN, what are the limitations in some countries, but also what is the perimeter within which we work and we engage with the communities and civil society. Now, out of that, in that conversation, I think one of the highlights was the question around how do we define what is actually the definition of sustaining peace in that context like Cambodia, where there's no open conflict, but we see some tensions that are there, might be erupting. And I think we managed to highlight that the work that civil society and UN, but also community-based organizations do on a daily basis, like, for example, promotion of human rights, even demining, which in Cambodia is a prevalent issue. And you might have seen recently that Daniel Craig, the global ambassador, actually visited virtually and launched an initiative there 2 weeks ago. Women empowerment, social cohesion, they are all what I'd like to call acupuncture peace building. Small micro interventions that do have an impact over a sustained time horizon. And I think the result of that annual dialogue was an increased understanding between UN and civil society, and itself also reaching out to the communities. And in a very practical manner, also the output was a new project, a 3 years project that was trying to increase and bridge dialogue between civil society, community-based organizations, and the government in Cambodia. To my knowledge, the project started in June 2020 and is going as we speak. And the other output was, again, the second annual dialogue on sustaining peace, which took place just before my departure last year. And this time was a time of COVID, of course, and we had to, again, I think rewired the whole relationship, but also the modality of engagement. And I think it was useful in seeing how actually digital tools can increase our outreach to communities. Now, as I said, COVID has been quite a wake-up call for all of us, but I think also was a way to expose the fragility of the UN capacity to reach out outside the urban centers and reach out to the communities. I think it was a wake-up call, and also it was a way to remind us of how difficult it is to disaggregate within large baskets of demographic baskets. I think the guidance speak highly and greatly about youth-led peace building, but when you have a country like Cambodia with 60% more of people below 30 years old, and Tunisia is around maybe 40–50%, but still quite high percentages. How do you actually define and reach out to youth, where our usual suspect and kind of our shortcut is always to go and talk to the kind of networks we're plugged in, which is the most affluent families and youth, the well-educated, the affiliated within the unions, the civil society organizations, or the parties, and those, as we now see, connected through Facebook. But we know much less about a large, prevalent majority of hard-to-reach youth. And I think in this time of COVID, the kind of warning is it's quite interesting, and also how we want to implement now the community-based engagement guidelines. And this was one of the key questions, Hank Young, right, that you asked me to talk about. And I think what we see often, and maybe now talking more on Tunisia, is that we've seen sometimes a tokenistic approach to community engagement. We tick boxes, right? So we think that by going and seeking information in the communities, we ask interviews, we launch polls and surveys, so we have focus group discussions, we go and have an extractive relationship with the communities, which means we go, we ask, and then we leave, we depart. Now, here in Tunisia, through a Peacebuilding Fund project, actually we realized that communities, they resent this kind of extractive relationship, and they do want to have a sustained engagement. Now, a sustained engagement, I think it's really what is happening now with this project in Tunisia, which is implemented by UNDP, UNESCO, and UNWomen, which has seen really this investment being made through the creation of youth hubs, youth peace hubs in the south of Tunisia, where dedicated and empowered youth were our proxies that were actually able to translate our jargon, our initiatives into concrete outputs. And where this engagement that was mentioned before has been sustained over months. Now we're talking about a year and a half implementation, and the project just ended. Now the good news that some agencies are interested now to pick up from where it lasted and it ended. And I think this is the way to go, and this should be also a bit the caveat for implementing the guidelines, which is very much knowing your entry points and exit strategies for the engagement with communities, that unless we're prepared with good analysis, good people, good contacts and networks that we can sustain over time, it's much better than not to invest, not to engage, because that is very much, I think, do no harm 101, isn't it? That you don't want to create more problems than you created that were originally. So I think there is an ethical issue and question to be answered, and this may be also some material for the question and answer and the debate later on. So maybe I'll stop here. I don't want to take too much time from the debate and the discussion, but thank you again for engaging and involving us.
No, thanks so much, Fabio. And you really raised a couple of really good points, including the importance of who we engage with and the importance of continuing engagement. So it's not just, organizing a meeting and inviting some of the usual suspects. It's really important to engage very broadly, including with the unusual suspects, to establish relationships and that can be tapped into and can you build upon, in particular when a crisis emerges. This is something that we also very much recognize in the guidance that we developed on social movements and protests, that these protests are much more broader now than they were in the past, and that really requires engagement with a really broad set of actors, far beyond the usual large civil society organizations, but really requires to focus on communities and groups that are marginalized and excluded, including in remote areas. So very happy to move out to our next speaker. She is from Kyrgyzstan, as I mentioned. So very happy to see her already on the screen. Tojika Shabdanova, please, you have the floor. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Hank. Good morning, good afternoon, and maybe for some of you, late evening, dear participants, colleagues. For me, this is a great opportunity to be a part of this event and to share our experience on working with UN system in Kyrgyzstan. And by the way, we are located in Central Asia. Organization I am presenting has had almost 20 years, I can say, good collaboration with UN on peace building and conflict prevention. And today I will try to highlight some of our practices and do maybe some relevant links with the community engagement guidelines. And I appreciate for development of the guidelines. I think it covered almost all important things to be taken into consideration. And I think that not only UN system, but we as civil society organization can also use these guidelines in our work, because it has almost coherent complex covering of different topics. Because I will start with programming. When we speak about partnership or collaboration between UN and civil society organization, I will start from national strategy development process. You know that UN usually develops peace building priority plan for midterm. Usually it's for 3 or 5 years, and in our country, in Kyrgyzstan, UN does really great work on that. They engage almost all stakeholders relevant to be part of the process, to analyze the context, to identify crucial and relevant program directions, what should be taken in peace building priority. And we as civil society organization, as different NGOs working in Central Asia, in Kyrgyzstan, we are part of this process. Even more, we are part of a high-level joint steering committee established between UN and Kyrgyz government to monitor of implementation of this PPP and do some evaluation. So in this way, we see good partnership links between UN and civil society. And here I would like acknowledge the inclusive approach to the development of this community engagement guideline with a series of global and more, let's say, targeted online consultation, as it was mentioned by Megan. And this is, in my opinion, a good example of how civil society could be integrated in the process from development into implementation and monitoring. And we see that the guidelines encourage also creation of different working groups, informal advisory bodies, bodies that enable truly joint solution. We have this kind of approach in our context also in KG, in Kyrgyzstan, when we have different working groups between UN and civil societies. But when we touch specific program or project development process, we see different UN agencies' approaches on collaboration. Some seek to work with civil society from the beginning, starting from program designing, planning, implementation, and monitoring. Of course, here, sense of, let's say, ownership and program background understanding is much stronger. Additionally, partnership, mutual responsibility and on achieving results. But some agencies prefer to engage civil society only on the stage of implementation. This is also not bad, but anyway, sometimes we see set of different activities. And so when we speak about monitoring and evaluation, I should say that unfortunately not all our peace building projects or programs have real coherent monitoring and evaluation components. In our organization, we try to use so-called approach of adaptive learning and improving practices, especially in our peace building and PV related projects, because they are really conflict sensitive issues in Kyrgyzstan. In our cooperation with UN agencies, we do together with our partners daily based monitoring and evaluation, when we analyze and discuss all our activities, every step, even small things, just to avoid any, as Hank said, to be in line with principle do no harm. Then why I speak about monitoring and evaluation, this also should be part of as a part of this guideline. This is also important because usually in practice we wait until end of project evaluation when we receive a lot of recommendation ideas how we need to improve our work, how things might go differently, but it comes after end of project, and sometimes we think, okay, but when we have finished, how we will use this kind of recommendations. And when in practice we see that most lessons learned and best practices, they are still on the table in good final reports, because in UN civil society practice, lessons learned and best practices, they are not transformed from one program to another on, let's say, institutional permanent basis. Usually civil society mostly keeps this kind of memory. And in this regard, I see one critical opportunity in the community engagement guidelines. It's focused on how partnership could be built to be more meaningful. I mean, this includes, for example, systematic and institutionalized engagement, where resources and time are included or dedicated by the UN colleagues to engage with civil society. Unfortunately, in work, it's hard to keep communication just to keep it. Let's say it. Usually, colleagues prefer to discuss only hot topics or when it's necessary. But we understand that communication with civil society organization, seeing what is going in the context requires more time, requires more resources, and of course it's about willingness. And here the guidelines also encourage risk-aware engagement, which is critical in many political contexts. And one thing I also want to share that the collaboration becomes, for example, hard to manage and coordinate when there is a joint programming between one and more UN agencies with different civil society organization partners. Because again, it's about complexity of programming. It's about spending a lot of time, resources, knowledge just to coordinate every program when we see that one program can cover different topics. And sometimes even if we have jointly agreement on doing coordination, collaboration, jointly planning, implementation, in real life, the work goes separate with sometimes with some duplication and interruptions. And I think that it's critical. Maybe it should be part of this guidelines also to highlight this kind of coordination and cooperation between UN agencies when they have one joint programming as one UN, let's say. Yeah. So it's about programs. Now I would like just to mention some experience on UN on engagement with UN in different political situations. For example, in our country, last decade, our official authorities tried several times to shrink spaces for civil society organization to reduce our independence, freedom through legal and illegal, let's say, tools, ways, including widely blaming us as spies. And in such conditions, we see that UN has a power to support civil society organizations, to provide needed consultation, organize dialogue, and show some political support. And I fully support the CAG recommendation on safety and protection. And I think even more, this support should be done on a daily basis. I would like to say maybe very easy and simple example, but in our context, I think it works. For example, the UN can easily acknowledge and appreciate civil society partners in their communication with regional and national authorities, with communities, even in their visibility materials. UN has trust and credit, and they can talk about the role and contribution of civil societies in their public events. Just to mention that everything good in peace building and development processes were done together with us, with civil society organizations, and it also will somehow provide us support. But however, unfortunately, in some cases, the UN reports only about its own contribution without mentioning local partners. But it's not all the time. But anyway, sometimes it seems as usual practice. I do not want to take a lot of time. I think we will have time during pool. And in conclusion, I just want to say that it's indeed important to ensure that guidelines will be intentionally implemented. And we believe that if this community engagement guidelines inform and are consulted during the development of national and regional community engagement strategies, our joint UN and civil society organization separate efforts in building sustaining peace can become more impactful. Thank you very much for your attention. Thanks.
No, thank you so much, Tajika. That's really great. You really raised a couple of really important points. For example, the point that we often in the UN engage with civil society with regard to implementation. And this is really something that the Secretary General explicitly recognized, that is, we really need to move beyond that. We need to engage communities in the analysis of the problems, in the solutions of the problems, and then, of course, in the design of how to address those solutions. And then, of course, they can also be involved in the implementation. And then finally, I think what is really important is actually engagement of communities in the monitoring and evaluations, so that we talk to the people who are supposed to benefit from some of the things that the UN is engaged in, and to make sure that we actually reach the objectives that we set for ourselves. And the only way to do that is talk to the people in the communities, to focus on people, on men, women, children, boys and girls. And that's really, really important. And I think that's part of the objective of the engagement guidelines, that we do that. The other point you made is that Fabio also makes is do no harm. That really needs to be, as Fabio said, the one-on-one, the principle that we all need to be guided by, and that engagement with the wrong people it can really affect our neutrality, our independence as a UN organization, and it can affect our credibility and our reputation, and of course can also do harm to the people on the ground. We talked about the importance of protection of civil society actors, the protection of peace building actors. And the last point I want to mention that you highlighted is the importance of civil society being the memory, being the institutional memory. Unfortunately, it is how the UN works that often people are only engaged in a particular country for a number of years, and therefore the UN and its civil servants can never reach the level of knowledge and expertise that exist among community participants and civil society who live on a daily basis, who have been born and lived their whole life within the communities and see the conflict dynamics and have seen the conflict dynamics up close. So with that, we very happy to have such an excellent panel. We will move first to Marina to report the poll results to us, and then we'll move to a question and answers. I see already some questions in the chat function. We also have given the opportunity for people to send us questions in advance, and we will go to those questions as well. And then, of course, you always can also raise hands in the participants list function as well. So the various possibilities to engage. We have still about an hour left, so quite a bit of time. Of course, I want our panelists to come in as well. As some questions are specifically addressed to some panelists, and I hope to be able to give also the floor at the end to them to wrap up. We also have a few UN colleagues who have been very much involved in the development of the guidelines, and I also we also asked them to highlight how these guidelines are important to them and how they are using them, and I will also give them at one point the floor. But first, I give the floor to Marina to talk about the poll results. Marina, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Henk-Jan. And now on your screen, you should be seeing the results of the poll. So as we've mentioned in the beginning, it was intended to be your first impression on the conversation as we were going into it, and some of those thoughts may have changed, right? And we would like to hear any follow-up impressions, but from the immediate impressions, what we did see is that a lot of you have seen the community engagement guidelines as an opportunity to develop strategy that responds to the most urgent issues as identified by the communities. And I do think that we have heard that from this conversation a lot today, because the guidelines, they unpack what intentional and meaningful partnerships mean. This includes systematic and institutionalized engagement, where resources and time is dedicated by the UN colleagues to engage with community actors and include them in peacebuilding work. And we have seen this a lot today in the conversation. The guidelines also encourage risk-aware engagement, which is critical in many political contexts. And finally, the guidelines encourage the creation of working groups and informal advisory bodies that enable truly joint solutions. So all of this is an opportunity that we see in the community engagement guidelines as a way to develop those strategies that respond to the most urgent issues as identified by the communities. But as we see on the screen in the poll results, other aspects of the community engagement guidelines are as important. And one of them is an opportunity to strengthen and build new partnerships between the UN and community actors more broadly, right? That includes local peace builders, that includes civil society, and any other actors who may or may not be identified as quintessential peace builder. So one of the elements that is critical in the community engagement guidelines is that it requires inclusive mapping of existing peace building work that is taking place on the ground. And Fabio spoke a little bit about it in terms of how we identify those most, I guess, disjointed from the mainstream peace building work and how we engage them into the conversation. Because a lot of what we've seen in our work, and Tajikan also spoke about it, is that we tend to work with people we work with all the time, right? But innovation may sometimes come from the opportunity to work with those in the most remote areas, with people who have not been part of the conversation, but can bring a new breath and new spirit into our peace building efforts. So moving into discussion, on behalf of the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict, GPPAC, I would like to reiterate some of the questions that have been also brought in the chat, is to really hear from the UN colleagues, what are the first impressions in terms of community engagement guidelines? What are the thoughts and questions in terms of the implementation of those community engagement guidelines in practice? It's really important for us to see the establishment of those regional and national community engagement strategies. And we see it as a next logical step. And we would want to join the conversation and see how we as a civil society can support the implementation of the community engagement guidelines moving forward. So perhaps we could hear some ideas today from our UN colleagues and about how the community engagement guidelines could be implemented in different contexts, and also what are some of the challenges that we see in this process. So I'll stop sharing and moving to Henk-Jan again for our discussion.
Thanks so much, Marina. An interesting result on the poll. Clearly, the need to develop strategies, as the Secretary General called for in his report in 2018, is actually the winner. But there are a couple of very strong second and third places in terms of strengthening the partnership and advancing the voice and peace in communities. So thank you so much for participating in this. So maybe because of your emphasis, the questions that both Marina and also in the chat, I see going back to the UN of how they plan to implement it. I want to give the floor to our UN colleagues, but just to say that we have distributed it very widely. We discussed it actually at the highest levels in the UN, in particular the Deputies Committee. So this is a body that is deputies of the Executive Committee of the Secretary General. So this is almost as high as you can get in the UN. And we have distributed it very broadly both to our colleagues that work in peace operations, as well as colleagues who work in country team in the agency funds and programs in the development system. And I'm sure they have reached it perhaps through different channels 2 or 3 times. But of course, just getting the guidelines does not mean that they're implemented. And so that is really where, of course, the crux is. And therefore, we very much also want to keep encouraging, and we will work on that in the next a couple of months and years to come. But just to say that when we did when we drafted the report of the Secretary General on peace building last year, we saw a very clear trend already that the UN has been working much more at local peace building efforts than in the years before that. And that is something that we both saw in the country teams, in the development system, and also in peace operations. And I think that is something that is related to the trend that I described in the beginning about the changing nature of violent conflict, and that a lot of the conflicts happen at the local level around land and water. And so that trend of working at the local level, working with communities, is really key. And maybe I add one more point on that it is what I really think is important about, we talk about communities, that it's not just about organized civil society. It's really about people, about individuals, about engagement with communities that are not necessarily organized in any way, in any particular formal structure, but really go to the people themselves and engage communities and people. And so I think that was one comment that I saw in the chat as well. So maybe Birgit Kainz-Labé, our colleague from the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, maybe I can start with you and ask you about how you, with your colleagues on the ground, tend to really implement the community engagement guidelines. Birgit, you have the floor.
I cannot unmute. Can you hear me now? Yes, I see that I'm unmuted. Yeah, I tried to unmute and it told me we cannot unmute you. So I'm very, very pleased to be there at this very inspiring and important meeting. And I cannot tell how, listening to you, I would like to say a million things, as I'm sure many of you would do, but I'll try to limit myself to some of the kind of key thoughts that I had when I listened to the earlier speakers, and of course also when making comments earlier on and now reading the final version of the community engagement guidelines. As you have heard, as Henk-Jan has said at the beginning, we have also worked almost in parallel on a UN-wide guidance note on civic space. My colleague Batar has circulated the link to everyone. And if you allow me, I would just like to say 2 things about this UN guidance note, which very much are in sync with everything we have heard about the community engagement guidelines. I think it does really, I liked what Fabio said about the extractive relationship. I think when you look from a human rights point of view, which we do at UN Human Rights, that's not what we want. So what we have tried through the UN guidance note is really to kind of start a culture shift where we move from this extractive relationship to a point where really we understand civil society on the ground as the main agents of change and where we support that change. Yeah, so very much in line with what has been said. That's I think the beauty of the guidance note, that's our point of departure. And it really recognizes that civic space is not a human rights issue. It's not an issue for a few isolated people. It's an issue for everyone who tries to contribute to his or her society. Yeah. And we, in order to make any kind of progress, be it on peace building, be it on sustainable development, be it on human rights, obviously, we need that space for people to access information, share information, speak up, and say critical things also. Yeah. So that's that's one of the kind of important achievements of the guidance note. And the second one is really civics participation, and what you call more engagement is not happening in a void. Yeah. You cannot just say, I engage. You have to look at where you engage, and you have, that brings you to the human rights again. You have to look a bit at freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, you know, the right to protest, and really understand the context in which you are trying to engage, and of course then also look at the safety, and that's also very nicely done in the community engagement guidelines. I really like the point about protection. When we worked on this UN-wide guidance note, so which is really also has been adopted for the entire system, one of the things I learned that I really found fascinating is all parts of the UN are working one way or another on this, but everyone calls it differently. Yeah, so you have a lot of the engagement on the humanitarian side, on the peace building side. You have a lot of cohesion and resilience and so on the on the development side. And I recently learned that in the WHO context, they call it social accountability. So, but we should not, you know, we should not, we have to look through those different words, because in the end, everyone is talking about the same thing. And this is this desire to decide about our futures, to be part of the decision making about our own futures. And what I'm sometimes a bit missing, not so much in your document, but in other parts, and I think it's also something we have to collectively work towards, is really, you know, it's not a favor that anyone accords to people. You are allowed to participate, or I share this information. This is about rights that people have. They have it at the local level, they have it at the national level, and they also have it at the international level. And I think it's, you know, it's really something I'd love to explore a bit more, how we can bring those different asks from the different UN pillars and silos together and show how we all talk about the same thing. Just one sentence, it also has come through a little bit, you know, one of the things I've said, you have to watch a bit the freedom side of things. So can people actually say what they want to say? And of course, we've already touched upon it. Online civic space has become hugely important. And under the Secretary General's call to action, we have also been asked to co-lead a process looking at online civic space, and, you know, what does freedom mean online, and what is the UN's role in watching some of the challenges in terms of surveillance, in terms of, you know, regulation of social media platforms. And those are very complicated questions, but as we figure out the responses, we need to all really, you know, work together and learn from each other also. And then just one last point, because many people asked about the role of civil society. I mean, you know, we looked at different models, and there are, as you know, in the humanitarian sphere, for example, there are very structured ways of civil society participation through all sorts of groups under the EASC mechanism. So the civil society really is part through umbrella organizations, which is not ideal, but of course, you know, you have to find some sort of, some way for channeling those inputs, really giving a lot of input into at all stages of decision making and implementation. And I think it's very important that we also, you know, look beyond our own pillars to learn from those experiences, learn what works well and what doesn't work so well, and try to push for better structures for not only inputting but also accountability. Yeah, ultimately, I mean, also for our bigger UN guidance note on civic space, we know that we will need civil society to hold us to account collectively, and it's very important that we work together on a good system of keeping you informed, very much using new technologies, but also being aware that that's not a channel that reaches everyone. Sorry, it was a bit long. Thanks a lot again for having me.
No, thanks so much, Birgit. You make a couple of very good points, and I think this culture shift that you mentioned, I fully agree with, and that is something that we all have to work on within the UN system, but also I think civil society playing a role in making the UN accountable in that regard. The other point, where so many different parts of the UN, and you mentioned even the WTO, which is not part of the UN system formally, engaging the civil society. And I think one of the issues indeed that the guidelines, I think, also focus on is indeed that there might have really a need to coordinate among the different entities. And that's why the strategies, the demand for strategies of the entire UN system at the field level, as the Secretary General asked for, are so important. I like your point that it's not a favor, it's a right. This is very clear in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. The people, and also, for example, the Convention on the Rights of Children, that we have the right to participate in decision making. And that is, of course, really critical. The online space is becoming more and more important. So thanks for raising that as well. Can I now ask UNDP to step in? I don't know, I saw Sam at one point, and Monica as well. I don't know who wants to talk on behalf of UNDP, but of course, UNDP has one of the broadest networks of the UN system, so I'd like to hear from them as well. If they would like to take a few minutes, that's fine. We can, in the meantime, maybe go to Tatiana of UNWomen.
Yes, thanks a lot, Henk-Jan, and thank you to previous speakers. I think the discussion is really, really exciting. And for us as the youngest entity in the UN, UNWomen, we were created at the demand of civil society. So not only we are proud of that, but also we feel the value, we feel the tremendous pressure on that, and we feel the huge responsibility to really keep carrying the torch and to make sure that the principles that are promoted in the Women, Peace and Security agenda are also applied by the whole system. Our strong historic connection with the civil society, we take it very seriously. Those who work with us, you know that we have civil society advisory groups in all of the offices where we are working. We have partnership agreements and not contracts and subcontracts when we do programming with civil society, and we really do share the approaches and the final outcomes of our joint programs. Women, Peace and Security is an agenda that has been developed and advocated by women peace activists, and it builds on the roles of women in conflict prevention, resolution, protection, peace building and recovery. Inclusivity and meaningful participation Participation is also the link that connects women, peace and security agenda and the sustaining peace concept that was built up and adopted by the Security Council and the General Assembly 15 years after the Women, Peace and Security agenda was adopted. Colleagues already talked about peace being more sustainable if it's built on the local initiatives and with the local communities, so I won't be repeating that. But I will highlight that a study that we carried out together with PBSO and the World Bank for the Pathways for Peace a couple of years ago confirmed that women-led peace-building initiatives are cost-effective, they build and strengthen trust, and they are sustainable in the longer run. Unfortunately, in the context of the pandemic that we are all facing, that does not only exacerbate inequalities, violence, and insecurity, but also puts local organizations at the risk of being defunded, at the risk of being pressured due to all the securitized responses to the pandemic and political pressures. It's really critical that the UN support and response is also focusing on protecting local peace builders and human rights defenders. And I think this guidance is an essential step and a critical element that really adds to the unique approaches that UN is applying globally, regionally, and on the ground. And the earlier iterations, those women's organizations who I see present online today would remember Nothing for Us Without Us campaigns. So I see that as an earlier iteration of this guidance that is really suggesting that when we do the analysis for our programming, we should absolutely do the gender responsive and human rights analysis and bring local actors into the process. That we should build our programming on local solutions and not parachute with our innovative ideas that wouldn't be acceptable by local communities. That we don't speak for women and for local actors, but we rather bring them to the table and let them speak for themselves and for their communities, because our practice shows that women do not only bring the valuable intelligence and analysis from the ground, they also bring creative solutions that have long-term results. Invest in local actors, but also invest in inclusive processes. We know that consultation is not free of charge. It doesn't come free for us. So we have to be able to also budget in our UN's programming for inclusive approaches that allow us carry out regular consultations, regular dialogue with civil society. And also, as the previous colleague mentioned, stand up for human rights and stand up for women's rights. We as the UN carry that important flag. It's not always a very comfortable agenda for the UN in many places in the world right now, but protecting defenders is an essential element of our mandate. And building inclusive spaces for diverse stakeholders of different age, of different sex, of different ethnic, social, education background, and so on, is really critical for the UN. So as you can tell, we are very excited and we are very welcoming the guidance. We are looking forward to its implementation, and we hope that many other parts of the UN will be joining our efforts, and it won't be just the usual suspects of UNWomen and OHCHR chasing others and asking to hold consultations with civil society on the ground. So we are excited, we are looking forward, and it's excellent and great to see you all online. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tatiana. The UNDP is having some technical difficulties, so maybe we take a few questions from the floor, from the participants, also some of the questions or comments that were submitted beforehand. So maybe I will read a few of those. So one is, there's quite a few, I think, around next steps. We touched upon it already, but so one of the questions is, what is the next steps after this event? How will the UN community engagement guidelines strategies for improving local civil society actors and partnerships with the UN in the field in peace building? One is around funding. Small CSOs cannot meet the criteria to access funding resources or do not have the capacities. Can the UN recognize this and support capacity building of CSOs, civil society organizations? I mean, this is also maybe, I'm very happy to address that as well, but maybe when UNDP speaks, they can maybe also address this. This is more of a comment. We need research on the peace building indigenous institutions around the world to build it on further. It has strong roots in communities. People trust on it, they test it, they own it. The same we did in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Pakhtun communities on the Jirga, update it with modern conflict resolution and scientific methods, especially restorative justice. The next question is about, can the UN play a role in helping connect grassroots people, peace building organizations? Grassroots peace builders should be linked with each other to share their experiences and learn from each other. The UN should play a role of focal point. So there's also a question, that is one on in the COVID context, how the implementation of these guidelines will be affected by the COVID pandemic. How will this particular guidelines be implemented in the context of COVID is the question. How will the guidelines be implemented at the country level? Is there a thinking of pilot implementation in some countries? And finally, implementation in the field, ensuring the buy-in of the country teams. Could you talk more about plans for implementation in the field, including how you intend to develop buy-in from country teams and shift some of the current thinking and practices? The next couple of questions and comments are more about participation. One I think I partly addressed already, participation of informal civil society groups, including within UN processes. What is the space for them to participate in the UN system? What is another point, what is meant by meaningful participation and how to ensure sustainable partnerships? Also, how do the guidelines define meaningful participation and engagement? And how will you ensure that these partnerships are sustainable, which I think will help make them meaningful for both the UN and civil society? So there's one point in particular about do no harm. I've heard do no harm being emphasized. What level of detail is covered in the guidelines on that? If not, would it be possible to annex some principles and steps in do no harm for increased integration in peace building and development initiatives? So Fabio was asked in particular, about the token approach to youth engagement, and this is a challenge with the unemployed youth in particular, and where the political class manipulate and exploit them. So these are quite a few comments and questions. So I very much, perhaps the panelists, of course, but also our colleagues, Marco and UNDP can perhaps respond as well. So Marco Donati, I don't know whether you are on the line. I see Osa in terms of UNDP, but is Monica or Sam able to respond? Osa, can you give a thumbs up or a thumb down? I hear something.
I managed to get back.
Oh, here's Marco. Here's Marco. Okay, great. Well,
Yes.
Marco, why don't you go first?
Yeah, sorry, it took a little bit to unmute myself. I just want to emphasize a couple of things. From a peacekeeping perspective, the issue of engaging with communities and civil society actors. Of course, it's not new. We already had a number of guidance products for peacekeepers on engaging civil society and community engagement. And I think it's true that even though the engagement idea is not new, I think it's only over the last few years that the qualitative importance of how we engage with communities and civil society has evolved. And of course, we already mentioned the HIPPO report in 2015, people-centered approaches in peace operations as really important. But I think it's not surprising, given that, if you take it from a peace and security angle, the emphasis is indeed on finding political solutions. And as we look at political solutions, and although traditionally these have been understood to concern mainly governments and parties to the conflict, I think, increasingly so, there is a realization that engaging with the local stakeholders, communities, and civil society is essential to find, sustainable solutions. And I think the way this is being translated, and I think, it's an uphill evolution in the context probably of the UN in general, but of peacekeeping in particular, is how do you indeed move away from the more security-oriented, extractive nature of engaging with local actors to understand the context and see it really from a security and threat perspective, to one where you are working with these interlocutors indeed to seek and create opportunities, I would say, in space for political solutions. But I think many of the panelists have already mentioned the importance of analysis because indeed, once again, we can run the risk of imagining a very harmonious and homogeneous civil society and to imagine that communities are all alike. And that would miss the point, because it would miss our opportunity to better understand what are their specific interests, what are the tensions between societal groups that are indeed not necessarily having a unique and harmonious vision of what is the next step to build peace. So I think it's really important indeed to emphasize how these principles of the guidelines and how we are better integrated into analysis and analytical processes. And in this sense, Henk-Jan, you already mentioned the importance of the local dimension. And I think in peacekeeping, especially from where I sit, which is working with civil affairs components, the emphasis is really trying to support solutions to local conflict dynamics, intercommunal conflicts. And in that regard, there's no other way of doing it but engaging with communities. And I think it's really important that while bearing in mind that there are tensions between the aspirational level of the principles that the guidelines are embracing and that that we are aspiring to, with the realpolitik of warlords and armed groups and political manipulation and all of those things. But I think what is really important is to really have a compass that helps us understand how to do engagement with communities and civil society in a meaningful way, one that indeed focuses on doing no harm, because I think it's been mentioned, but it's something that we can lose track when we throw it out there as a principle but not fully understand what it means, and that sometimes the way you engage or just engaging for the sake of engaging can cause harm. And so, once again, I go back to this idea of a better analysis that informs the planning. And in this sense, I think the efforts that have been going on at different levels in peacekeeping, I think are meaningful in terms of how we better try to engage with local stakeholders. But I think one element that the guidelines can contribute to further enhance is having a coherent shared approach, because as some of you that are more familiar with peacekeeping might know, there is a tendency of having a siloed approach within a mission, because there is a uniform component, military component, different civilian substantive sections, and there is a risk of engaging the same actors from different angles and not necessarily always delivering the same messages, not having a very coherent approach to understanding their priorities and concerns and how to address them, which I think it's really something that we want to focus further on, how to bring together different parts of a mission in engaging consistently and coherently with communities. And maybe one last word, again, going back to the political solutions and some of the tensions that peacekeeping have being mandated by the Security Council under the assumption that we are there to support essentially the host government and the host state. And sometimes this creates tensions for peacekeepers on how to engage with civil society when civil society can be perceived as an opposition to the political regime, and how do you strike a balance between those. But I think it's also an opportunity, to create, again, political space for those constituencies to have a better entry point and a platform to dialogue with host government and political forces. So I think there are opportunities. They're not always seized, and it really is something that I think the guidelines can help create more awareness and understanding of within mission leadership, but also throughout the ranks of peacekeepers. So thank you again for the opportunity to share, and yeah, if there are any questions, I'll be happy to try and answer.
No, thanks so much, Marco. That's very good to hear the perspective of peacekeeping operations and the role of the civil affairs component of peacekeeping operations. And I like your emphasis on coherence in that regard within the missions, but of course the call for strategies at the UN system really also means coherence with the country teams. And the emphasis on analysis and the engagement of communities in the analysis is really key. I see that our UNDP colleagues have, in the meantime, also been able to solve their technical issues. So Monica is here, and I'm happy to give her the floor. And I hope you can also perhaps address some of the questions that have already been raised, but of course also highlight what UNDP in particular is doing, also in terms of implementation of the guidelines and how this is important for the work of UNDP. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Henk, and apologies, colleagues. I just got logged off when I was about to speak and couldn't log back in. So without repeating what, some of the importance of the community engagement guidelines, and many colleagues have already mentioned this. For us, from a UNDP perspective, just to bring to the fore of building national capacities for conflict prevention, peace building. We use this phrase quite often, and I think we use this phrase quite often also in the UN system, but for us, engaging communities and building capacities of communities is at the heart of building national capacities. So it is for communities to lead their own peace building processes, and as Marco mentioned, their own, and inform and lead their own political processes. And they are also very closely aligned with the development process that is, ongoing in a country. So it is, for me, when I look at it, it is about informing development processes in their own country, led by governments, but also led by international actors. So it really meets the needs of the communities. There is an aspect somebody raised about, extractive. And I remember when I was in Myanmar, the community were, in Rakhine were like, they were fed up. They were like, development actors come to us with some survey, do an assessment, and they leave. Humanitarian actors come, we do the same survey, the same questions. you know, why can't, and the community was saying, why can't you coordinate? So a point well noted, Henk-Jan, on a proper coordination in terms of, you know, analysis, but in terms of us, you know, there's one thing of use, you know, talking about communities to help us deliver, but that's not the point. The point, at least for us, would be how do we take the voices and of the communities to the national planning processes to inform our programming and to inform the development of national priorities. I think for us that is key. We see a lot of community engagement in the way UNDP does its work on HIV/AIDS, for example, and also on local governance. You know, how we support the government to convene the civic space, to engage, to inform their local planning processes, but also importantly, you know, handle grievances. So there is a whole component of that. And we, like, you know, if you, and I have colleagues out here online and they can also speak, for example, you know, there's a whole community engagement for peace building and building the peace blocks, it's called, like in Lebanon, but also using capacity development initiatives like conflict sensitivity, social cohesion in different countries that we use to engage communities. So we deploy SCORE, the Social Cohesion and Reconciliation Index, in, you know, Moldova, Ukraine, for example, and that's a way for us to also dialogue, in a continuous dialogue with the communities, but to inform our analysis on social cohesion and inform our programming and inform the government's programming. So that's important. While the analysis is important, there's also a component of early warning that comes. We need to protect our sources. We need to protect our, the analysis, yes, the integrity. We need to do that. We have to be conflict sensitive. But there is a very important component of early warning. And if I'm not mistaken, you know, many years ago, this was done quite nicely in Sri Lanka. But did we act early? You know, that's a big question. So if we are able to, you know, get our early warning systems in place, you know, engaging communities, then how can we build capacities of communities to also act? And we support that. I think there is a component there that we can look at. And on social cohesion, you know, we have extensive work on social cohesion, on working with communities, as I mentioned, you know, Moldova, Ukraine, South Africa, to address issues of xenophobia. And we have, like in Maldives, you know, we use social cohesion, community engagement on addressing issues around young people and violent extremism. And in the Deep South in Thailand, we are looking at social cohesion, engaging communities, and food security. So there are all different aspects of it, how we bring together. So that, you know, we're using development solutions and bringing them to the fore for community engagement, but importantly for peace building outcomes. Yeah. So those are, you know, some examples. And then another example I want to, and I shared the guidance actually on the insider mediation. We've, you know, worked in, like, I can say for now, 14 countries, but there are many more, in which we are working with community leaders who have the legitimacy, who have the reach across the political divide or the conflict divide, and they are basically a country's internal mediation capacity, and we build their, and we engage with them to help them do what they do best. Yeah, like for example, in Nepal, you know, we were working with local, we don't call them local, but we call them insider mediators, because they work nationally, locally, across, linking both around issues around land reform, constituent assembly, you know, elections, be it about, you know, bringing in youth, the political leaders of the youth wing around election violence. And, you know, like if you have that in Bosnia, and, you know, there are like 14 countries, we've really done some, you know, good work around insider mediation. And that's also a capacity that something we should not be, you know, we should be mindful of, and in fact, be working more proactively to build consensus around the political divide. And as Marco was saying, around, how do we reach political solutions? Is it as outsiders we fly in and build political solutions, or we build the capacity internally on building those political solutions and those peace building solutions? And then the final one is on infrastructures of peace. We've done some really good work in Ghana and Togo and Philippines on infrastructures of peace, working with young people, formal, informal institutions, and civic society. And most recently with COVID and the shrinking space of civil society with COVID, we think it's much more important for peace builders to be at the front, at the forefront of COVID planning, analysis, response, and also, how do we engage the infrastructures of peace more proactively, as a part of a COVID response. So from UNDP side, we've partnered with GPPAC, and right now we are having like these 5 regional consultations with peace builders and local as well as national level to see how the COVID has impacted. One thing is the civic space, the peace building actors, the way they work, and how it has impacted the way they respond and how they have adapted. And importantly, how it has impacted overall the infrastructures of peace, and come up with some policy recommendations that we can move forward. We can collectively start thinking on what the new generation infrastructures of peace requires from us and our support. That's one. The other is also, this is very much aligned to UNDP's bigger output, our thinking on how do we then elevate local lessons and local voices to the policy discourse. And when I say policy discourse, we are talking about, yes, New York is one, but the policy discourse even within a country. Right. And I think that's an important thing, because when we talk about policy, there are different levels of policies. I leave here, there's a lot to share, but we can continue the conversation. Sam is here, and I see Johanna is here also from Lebanon. She might want to add. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Monica. That's great. We are having 15 minutes left. So I want to read a few more questions and comments that have come in the chat function in particular. And then I want to go back to our panelists, in particular Fabio and Tartika. So some very good comments and questions. The first one is really a comment. This conversation is really important, and the UN is needed to lead this shift in development practice. The movement for community-led development strongly agrees with these guidelines. We believe the community engagement in all processes, including M&E monitoring and evaluation, is absolutely essential. We at MLTLD have collaborated over 2 years with many organizations, global and local, to work to address this. We have developed 2 tools to work on community engagement and programming through a very collaborative process with multiple rounds of testing and piloting. Very good. Another comment: the modalities for implementing the community engagement guidelines have critical elements like conflict analysis, conducting analysis, mapping, etc. But they are not new or radical. These are practices that UN staff should be competent in and able to use in their daily work, but they have not been prioritized. So that might be some truth in there, and that's why we really are engaging very much with our colleagues to make sure that these guidelines are implemented. I hope these guidelines will underscore this work as official priorities of UN staff and country teams, and give staff justification for engaging with civil society in all of the UN's work, including with the cooperation frameworks and the analysis that we do jointly. There's actually specific guidelines for that, to engage with stakeholders and communities in the development of the cooperation framework. A question about migrant populations. In the context of forced migrants in host communities, What will be the best approach to conduct inclusive, community-led or oriented mapping and analysis? Next question, how does and will the UN handle issues of accountability and power in its relationship with local actors and civil society? I think we touched upon that partly already. Are there sections of some sort with key recommendations per region stemming from the community in these regions as opposed to the UN, of course, given that there might be significant difference on how to engage and if there are no specific sections where the inputs from communities in different regions favored in the analysis? Well, there certainly was no favoring of inputs of community in different regions. The consultations were global, and so we had participants of all regions. And the national consultations, as Megan talked about, also covered all regions, Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And then maybe finally one comment on the importance of engaging communities in a sustainable manner and ownership in their participation. There are good and bad practices. One bad practice consists in connecting community engagement with some sort of retribution for individual participants. Covering objective costs, such as travel costs, at realistic rate is normal. Other financial retributions can really be an obstacle to sincere engagement. It actually can do harm to future engagement initiatives by creating financial expectations of community members. It's important we find the right, sustainable and fair ways for engaging with communities in a way that see their participation and their ownership intervention as a community contribute to their community's development and peace as a common good. Very much a very good point. So I'd very much like now to go back to the panel. First, maybe start with our last speaker. So we go with Tajikan first before going to Fabio and Megan. So Tajikan, you are welcome to provide some comments, answers to questions, what you have heard from your perspective.
Henkan, just apologies, Tajikan has already left because it's quite late in Kyrgyzstan at this point, but extending her apologies, on behalf of GPPAC, whom Tajikan is a member, I just wanted to reiterate what we've discussed with Tajikan quite a bit ahead in the preparation for that meeting, is the idea that the partnership should really be built on free and independent knowledge of civil society. And this is something that she really wanted to reiterate through the messages. So I just wanted to pass this along and also encourage to look at the example of how the community engagement guidelines have been developed and use this example perhaps as a good practice study for the development of those regional national implementation strategies moving forward. And I hope we all as a group of those working on the project would be able to provide some support in terms of how that could be done. Thank you so much, and apologies from Tajikan's end.
No, thank you so much, Marina, and of course very much appreciate the time difference with Kyrgyzstan, and please relay our utmost gratitude towards her participation and her perspectives. Really much appreciated. So why don't I go then move to Fabio. Fabio, you have the floor. There were quite a few questions that were also directed at you particularly, but in particular also general to the UN. So feel free to address those as well. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. And this was a very rich conversation. Thanks, everyone. I'll maybe start with one question that was quite intriguing from Dennis. I think he asked about how do we integrate so-called informal groups. There is any space in the UN, he was asking. And I said, short answer is yes. And I do remember, this anecdote. Obama was just elected, and And there were so many different associations going and trying to visit the president of the United States. And at one point, there was one when there had a sitting with the president and said, look, we are a movement that, and the president stopped him saying, show me the movement, meaning like, where is the shaking and the moving that you're creating in society, right? So my point is about not really being confined about formal institutions. And the example in Cambodia was that actually when working on media resilience, we worked with some quite informal, organizations that were not even startups. So we helped them with a project to become startups and register, for example. But these were like young kids, young people from a rural background that had what? Great ideas, great reach, great network, honesty and commitment. They had the depth of the understanding of the political dynamics and the opportunities in the country. And now all those qualities sometimes are not within existing organizations that have a structure, an organigram, a funding flow. So we need to find those informal institutions. There is space, a mechanism, they seed funding for that, for example. Now, the challenges are, procurement and the way the UN works. Sometimes we struggle to find actually ways to work with them. And this has been quite frustrating, but quite annoying also to speak in this very rich conversation. But I think you get my point on that. On the second, Laurie asked, what is meaningful engagement? And it's true. I mean, we use that very much without specifying. So I was putting down some bullet points. And to me, meaningful engagement means creating an impact out of the feedback that we get, so that the voices that we try to lift, people we try to talk that have eventually an impact on, it's their voices are featured in the analysis, or they can participate, we create agency, but also how free do they feel to participate, how we're able to create an enabling environment for them to freely speak without telling us what we normally want to hear, right? And I think in that case, we have to have the humility not to be always the ones as UN staff, to be wanting to be there and engage with the communities. We need to find the right interlocutor or intermediary, if you want. What John Paul Lederach used to call the strategic who, the key person that has leverage, influence, and agency. That might not be one of the UN staff, but being able to work with her or him, who in turn will have access to those networks and then create this meaningful engagement. So kind of stepping away and not being always, the kind of superheroes of the situation. And probably, if I may, Enkiang, on implementation of the guidelines, I was thinking that, we're just using for early warning purposes. We are extending, because of COVID, our network of informants, of so-called regional antennas, and because Tunisia has been experiencing quite a lot of protest with the 10th anniversary of the revolution. And one of the key learning from this process has been that when we call something community, we don't quite know what community is. And we realized that community, in the case of the protest, was nothing more than the neighborhoods in the large cities, those marginalized areas. They are right close to where we live as expats. And we know so little about those communities. And so I think these guidelines will need to help us in understanding what are these key communities as such. And one of the recent streams of work, the UN, that has been the most community-based, I find, is the Climate Security Initiative, and the way it actually goes and looks into micro-conflicts, because in the end, those conflicts on natural resources and climate change or adaptation are the ones who are hitting first and the hardest the communities. So there's not much of a process in between. They are just, neglected, absorbed by the impact of climate change very quickly. And that is becoming something in theory, as we say, that is evolving, but it's quite interesting. And if I really made the last 30 seconds on grassroots organizations, somebody asked how we, as UN, we should be connecting them. And I think that's a catch-22 situation, because do we really want to connect grassroots organizations? If the purpose is protection, then yes. But if the purpose is like lifting voices, often in my experience, they don't want to be merged and put into the same basket. What we see as fragmentation is actually a rich element of diversity and multiplicity of voices. And we risk diluting those voices if you try to create alliances. But again, if it's for protection purposes, then yes, we should be able to play the role, again, finding those who can. Sorry for taking a few more minutes.
No, that's great, Fabio. Really, really important points. Thank you so much. So we are reaching almost the end of the 2 hours. But still, Megan, if you can be short, I want to give also, of course, you the opportunity to respond to some of the questions and comments.
Sure, thank you so much. And just to thank everybody for your time. It's just such a rich conversation that's been happening. And so I think on 2 particular questions I wanted to come to. So one, there was the funding question, which also touched a bit in the fuller text around the relationship between organizations at local, national, international levels. And so just 2 quick reflections there. One, particularly on the funding. I think we can all agree that ensuring flexible and accessible funding for local organizations has proven just so difficult for the traditional donor community. And many organizations, including those in this call, have been really active in advocating for more innovative approaches. And I think that this call is starting to be increasingly heard by the UN environment, by the broader donor community. And it really came through in the process itself of many participants along the way raising this as a key challenge. Which is why we have a lot of those different points in the recommendations themselves, and implementing those recommendations on funding are going to be critical for sustainable peace building programming. But then the question also, when looking at the larger text, is connecting on that, the relationships between organizations at different levels. And this also came up throughout the survey process, where colleagues were reflecting on some of the challenges that exist between how local, national, and international organizations interact with each other. And so we do have a section at the end of the guidelines that's specifically focusing on civil society, and it includes a paragraph that's really looking at that issue of relationships and what are the roles for intermediaries, for INGOs, how are they to be responsible to also support local capacity building, to support efforts for local funding, and to make sure that there isn't a seizing of space when it is more sustainable and appropriate for those local actors to be the ones leading the charge. Another question that was, I think, one of the ones you raised, Hank-Jan, but I know it was one that we received ahead of the meeting. There's a question on restricted space and the role of the UN. And, I know that our colleagues from OHCHR spoke about the Civic Space Initiative, but I just want to touch on how this came up in the survey process in particular, because during the survey process, the challenge of civic space was raised as the #2 challenge amongst participants, and the difficulty of how to operate in restricted spaces, but also the psychosocial impact of living within and working within that restriction was raised in the surveys, was raised in the VTC conversations. And so we really heard this and recognized this challenge, and worked to specifically develop that recommendation that's on protection, that's on safety, that third one. And it includes, an emphasis on promoting, protecting civic space, and how to create specific, context-specific protection needs. So I hope that will also contribute towards the other different tools, including the Civic Space Initiative, to be able to support expanding and protecting space, because this is going to be essential for building and sustaining peace. And then just in closing, I want to thank everyone again, to appreciate all of your time, and to just come back to that emphasis on implementation. As Hank-Jan mentioned before, this is where the crux is. And this rests now with UN colleagues at the field level and with civil society organizations, actors, leaders. And I hope that you'll see this tool as beneficial. And so say we were to come back together in a year's time, we'll find ourselves talking about the successes, the challenges for implementation, and to be able to have that space for continued learning and sharing across our global community that's working to build and sustain peace. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks so much, Megan. If everybody can turn on the camera, then maybe we can have a few more good screenshots. So thanks everyone. It has been a really rich discussion and comments. We would hope, I'm very sorry that we perhaps have not been able to address all questions and comments. There were quite a few streaming in the chat, and of course we had some beforehand already, but there was also quite a bit of overlap among the different points. So that was really much appreciated. One comment I just would like to mention also with regard to the financing, there's the Peacebuilding Fund has the opportunity to give money directly to civil society organizations, and has worked closely with many of you to try to reach also local actors wherever possible. And one other fund, the UN Democracy Fund, also gives funding directly to civil society organizations and works with civil society and UN colleagues also in terms of selection and implementation of projects. Really much appreciated. We are a few minutes over, so I think we should leave it at that. I wish you all really the goods of luck. Stay safe. But again, this is a joint effort. We need to engage communities. We need to engage with each other. So keep us accountable. Work with the UN. Find your interlocutors to engage and develop those strategies and create more peaceful and just societies. And that's what we all are in favor of. Again, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to everyone. And best of luck. Thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.